radio in the past 5 years or so with advice and insight has been solicited by sources such as the New York Times, The Moon, NPR, The Washington Post, the LA Ticket. And he just informed me that his iPhone just blew up because of apparently the resident of the fire. So he's going to be on the radio right after this lecture. So in essence, we are in the presence of nothing less than a woman according to our own Insight magazine. And her name is Ford. Now, this is largely owing to Dr. McCuan's expertise in the areas of domestic politics, and in particular, direct democracy, which all Americans will be more familiar with. But he has long harbored an interest in foreign policy and national security policy, and he teaches one of the most successful courses in our department on terrorism. His current research involves maritime terrorism, bioterrorism, and the impact of terrorism on civil liberties. A couple of years ago, Dr. McCuan was a Brandeis University Schusterman Fellow, which involved very intensive course of study in Israeli politics, and he, of course, spent a lot of time over in Israel. At any rate, we are very fortunate to invite his expertise on the subject of Syria, as well as our own Dr.
The lecture is dense. There's a lot of material here. I'm going to cover a lot of things. I'm going to talk about the Syrian situation, the difficulty of what's happening there in a broader frame of what's happening across Iraq. With the development today, every day is a busy day in politics with this administration, as you all know. But this morning, the president and the administration announced that they were going to begin arming Kurdish rebels to take on ISIS and Raqqa. And that's a huge development because that upsets our friends and fellow NATO members, the Turks. That has dramatic repercussions for what we do in Afghanistan. Watch what happens in Afghanistan over the next 2 to 3 weeks. General McMaster has a plan for upping what the United States will be doing beginning this summer in Afghanistan. Obviously, that impacts not only the situation in Syria, but the situation across the Middle East, or what in the Pentagon parlance and what in national security parlance is known as the arc of instability. I'll talk a lot about the arc of instability, how the Pentagon and warfighters and thinkers about changes in conflict have envisioned what's happening in Syria, the difficulties with that, and kind of highlight what's happening with ISIS. This is something I do in my course on terrorism and the other course on U.S. national security policy, but it might be helpful to place it in the context of what's happened with the genocide of the Yazidis and what's happened beyond the borders of Syria into Iraq and into areas that are Kurdish influence as well. So the talk is wide-ranging, it's dramatic. I wouldn't say it's particularly uplifting, but you're used to that after a semester, I think, of so many heavy topics. But also, I think this lecture does a nice job of tying together all of the ends of all the things you've been studying. And really, I want to begin there. I think you need to understand and think hard about how conflict and war has changed since the end of the Cold War from 1989 to 1991. At that time, we thought, and there were many writers who wrote about the end of conflict, that we were entering a period of robustness, that democracy had won. But since that time, we go to war a lot less, but we have a lot more conflict going on. The nature of conflict has changed. That means that the nature of genocide, the nature of displaced peoples, the nature of conflict across borders and without regard to borders or rules on the laws of armed conflict or rules over the laws of war, all of those things have fundamentally changed. Obviously, this changed dramatically after the events of 9/11 and changed even more so after our work and after our engagement in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'll cover as much of that territory as I can, as much of that material as I can. Again, it's very dense. But just to remind you that this news is moving very fast and changing all the time. This is the announcement this morning, again, at 11 a.m. to 12 noon, of what the United States was deciding to do, which changes the dynamic for the Syrian situation. It changes the dynamic for the meetings this morning that were held between Secretary Tillerson and Sergei Lavrov of Russia, which occurred today as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the case of Syria as an interdisciplinary case, a case that involves a lot of different fields of study for all of you with different majors, Many of you in political science, but not exclusively. So we're going to look at this case of Syria from many different angles. You're going to see lots of maps, you're going to see a bit of history, you're going to see a bit of religion, you're going to see obviously a bit of politics, and it's a nice fold into everything that you've been doing over the last 15 to 16 weeks. We'll look at the case of the genocide of the Yazidis specifically. We'll look at the impact of ISIS and the challenges of ISIS or IS or ISIL, its offshoot, its inspiration with Al-Qaeda. I'm going to give you some examples of places you can get information. I'm going to give you some advisement on where to get that information and under what conditions to get that information. That is, I'm going to show you some places to learn how ISIS thinks, but you're not going to do this at home. You're going to do this at the university. Because when you grab that information, our government is very interested in people who are grabbing that information. Okay? So I'll guide you through that. Now, if you don't like someone, you can go to their basement and you can go to their computer and you can download the information from their computer. But I'll guide you on that as well. We'll look at this and place this in the context of how war itself has changed. War is an outmoded concept, and conflict is a much more useful and helpful concept. In addition to this, we'll look at possible avenues moving forward for the United States. If it was easy to solve the problem in Syria, if it was easy to solve the problem of ISIS or Iraq or Yemen or Somalia or Morocco or the Philippines or the arc of instability, we would have done it already. And these are what we call sticky problems. These are problems that defy conventional solutions, defy easy military-style solutions, defy U.S. foreign policy and all the lessons we've learned over the Cold War and in succeeding years from the last 50 or 60 years. In addition to this, here's what we know about the case of Syria. We know that we have war-related atrocities that have occurred. We know that there have been clear war crimes and crimes against humanity, crimes of extermination, extrajudicial killings, all things that have been mentioned in Article 8 of the ICC, what's called the Rome Statute. I've provided this to Dr. Parnes, and you can also Google this, and you might want to look at it. It's an extensive list of war crimes, crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity. All of these crimes have taken place in the theater of Syria. In addition, they involve mass killings of civilians, political assassinations, indiscriminate attacks, chemical weapons use, incendiary weapons use, cluster munitions, cluster bombs, new weapons testing, especially by the Russians, as well as a displacement crisis and restrictions on humanitarian assistance. All of this ongoing as we speak. And this is traditionally how we've seen the situation like Syria, as an old civil war as opposed to a new civil war. And here's where I want to begin challenging your thinking. We want to think about this not as an old case, or ways that we've previously thought of civil wars. For example, old civil wars as a collective grievance with broad popular support and controlled violence. The situation in Syria involves gratuitous violence. Lots of extensive violence with unusual coalitions that form. Coalitions that aren't clear, as you'll see by the end of this lecture. Coalitions that are somewhat paradoxical, where you have regimes like the Iranians supporting the aims of those in ISIS. We have a Shia regime supporting the aims of Sunni activists because it destabilizes many of the actors that are going on. I'll show this to you in more detail. But what you see in the Syrian situation is a situation that defies easy solution and easy characterization. It defies and breaks a lot of rules and a lot of areas of conduct for how we think actually conflict has proceeded or war has proceeded since. And so it challenges us. You see new civil wars and the use of warlords, warlordism. You see clans and tribes that are both friendly to one another and not friendly to one another and form loosely knit coalitions. We see exactly this situation in Yemen. We see exactly this situation in Somalia and in southern and western Libya. We've seen it in the Sudan. So it is instructive for how conflict is changing. It's an interesting microcosm and case study, but also unique in terms of the challenges, as you'll see. Here's a U.S. State Department map from October 2014, which illustrates some of the dynamic of what's happening within Syria. I'm going to show you some additional maps and ask you to come to some conclusions about those maps. But this map from the U.S. State Department talks about the number of potentially displaced peoples and where they could go to the southern Turk border, how that could affect the Jordanian situation, how the border, if you will, between the east of Syria and the west of Iraq is lawless and problematic, and how it flows across borders and trans-border in terms of a conflict. This involves not only the population of the Yazidis and the Kurds, but it involves minor populations as well. with armies that are operating both in a traditional way, with uniforms, with codes of conduct, with rank and order, and additional groups that are operating almost freely, almost in a freelance way, almost what you might think in a mercenary-like situation, with loosely fitted coalitions and numbers of foreign fighters that come from Iran, a number of foreign fighters that come from Libya or Afghanistan, a situation not dissimilar or not that different from what we saw in Afghanistan, especially after the Soviet Union left. So it is both instructive and helpful, and also, again, different, just like before. This is an additional idea of the map and what's happening with Syrian refugees within Iraq itself, and how this conflict is spilling over and has been spilling over since 2014. Showing you elements of the Syrian Kurdish heartland, Raqqa, which is where the United States will begin a stronger hold and fight against ISIS here. That's the ISIS stronghold and the ISIL stronghold, and how that affects events that go as far as Mosul or Erbil, where the United States have been heavily involved in advising what's happening with Iraq. Here's the sectarian distribution within Syria itself. And what do you notice about the population of Syria? It's Sunni, but what else? Elements of Shia, Kurds, Bedouins, Alawites. It's complicated and a mess. For example, look at the populations and how they're distributed among certain areas and certain cities in the west versus the east. This is Raqqa, the home base, if you will, of the home state of ISIS, where they run a cabinet, where they have heads of state, they have ministers, just like you would see in any traditional government, running along areas. Pay attention to these strings of roads. That'll become important here in a little bit. Here's Damascus, Latakia. Why would this city be important? Who's operating there? Anyone know? The Russians. That's where the Russians are operating. All right? So you have the Russians, you have the United States, you have the Brits. I'll show you some of the complications of this in relationship to actors and what's going on. But what you see within Syria are a number of competing religious and ethno-nationalist groups, unlike or in some ways dissimilar from other places because of how they flow. And based upon your geography test, what nation is right here? Turkey, right? And there's a large Kurdish population there. The Turks are very worried about what's happening in that area, and as a result of that, it destabilizes. So our ability to arm, if you will, Kurdish rebels who are going to be involved in helping the United States in Raqqa is going to be hugely important for the stability of that region and what happens there. So if we look at what's happened in the particular case of the Yazidis, we see that ISIS has controlled territory going from about 2011, 2013, really accelerating in 2014 and 2015. And they didn't just suddenly appear. I'll walk you through ISIS and a bit of their history and how they've developed. But they had large levels of territory that they controlled and were involved in asserting their control over certain populations. And as a result of asserting their control over those populations, what they were particularly interested in doing was eliminating those that were less than believers, less than those that were pledging their allegiance to the regime and the true Quranic beliefs that they interpreted themselves. So this means they targeted lots of groups. They targeted, if you will, Christians. They targeted types of Kurds, Kurds themselves, those that were influenced by Kurds, like the Yazidis, and have done this all across the arc of instability. They've done this in Yemen, in areas of the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. They've done this in Sudan, in Somalia, and obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan. As a result of this long-ranging kind of idea of assaulting these populations, ISIS has drawn on the activities and inspiration of Al-Qaeda. Now that we have turned our attention to ISIS, what do you think is happening to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda's power today? The 3,000 or so fighters that remained of Al-Qaeda have now asserted their influence. So there's a rivalry that's developing between Al-Qaeda, between ISIS, and between al-Nusra, which is a group that broke off or is not affiliated with ISIS, as you will see, and a rival to it. There's a sense of rivalries going on in these destabilized areas. This is especially the case in Yemen, but it complicates the case for all of the actors in Syria itself. And it makes holding actors responsible for genocidal actions even more problematic. It makes it much more difficult to do this because it's unclear who exactly is promulgating genocide and who is sponsoring them. This is one of the issues and problems with what has happened with the chemical weapons or the purported chemical weapons attacks within Syria itself. In addition, notice that ISIS began its genocide against Yazidis and Kurdish populations in Mosul, which the Iraqi forces and the Iraqi government-backed forces recently liberated with the help of the United States and United States advisors. It's the second most populous city in Iraq, symbolically hugely important, and a symbol of both ISIS's power and then its loss of power. So ISIS is on its heels, and in the process of being on its heels, it has begun to revamp or revitalize how it's engaged in genocide, similar to what it was doing in 2014. So during this period of time, what we have seen is as the United States and Iraqi government have regained control in areas of Iraq, this conflict has spilled over and magnified the difficulty of the fighting in Syria itself, which places pressure on refugees flowing both north to Turkey and south to Jordan, destabilizing or challenging those regimes as well. So what you have is a conflict that has the potential to spin out of control. In the center of this is one nation with nuclear weapons, and what nation would that be? That would be Israel. So the potential for a powder keg in this area of the world is dramatic, and the consequences of this equally dramatic. So this genocide perpetuated against one population or a group of one population, its potential for growth and to spin out of control by all responsible nations, very dramatic as well, and illustrating how conflict is changing. Notice that ISIS spins out from their success of Mosul and moves to Nineveh and then to Tikrit with the idea to move to Baghdad later. The United States recognizes this, the Iraqi national government recognizes this, other nations recognize this, but ISIS is spinning out of control and growing in its influence. Mass killings, targeting all kinds of individuals, those that were deemed less pure in their beliefs, leading to mass refugee movements and displacements, mass killings, many of them on the internet and widely available. Targeting Kurds and the Yazidis. Targeting northern Iraq, western Iraq, eastern Syria, and parts of Syria itself. Again, a borderless trans-border conflict, and that's what's important, a borderless trans-border conflict, spilling, if you will, almost from the Mediterranean across to the Persian Gulf, with United States forces that were spread thin, with a coalition that was fracturing, and a previous administration that was unsure what to do next, and a current administration that's equally unsure how to solve this problem. If we could have solved this issue or this problem, we would have done it already. It is a perplexing situation which allows the genocide or the mass killings to continue or to be episodically used. And one way that that has happened is through the use of the media and some sources I'm going to show you in a little bit, where ISIS and others have been able to perpetuate the effect of their conflict, the effect of their killing, by using the internet and a particular magazine called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q, D-A-B-I-Q, Dabiq, which is the Time magazine of ISIS. I'll show you how to download it and where to get it, but again, don't do this at home, do this at the university. Here's an example of how the genocide has worked. In the 2014 period, for example, 5,000 men and boys, nearby villages massacred, shooting women and girls, those that were not enslaved. What other groups have enslaved women and girls? What other terror groups have operated this way? Boko Haram, most notably, right? And in the Philippines with groups, and IJ in Indonesia. But we see this technique all over. How do you think the technique is spreading or spilling over? Not only for its effectiveness, but because of the transmission of technique over the internet and the use of YouTube and Reddit and Facebook and Twitter. Groups like Al-Shabaab have used Twitter effectively in the Kenyan Mall attacks. They tweeted the Kenyan Mall attacks every 20 seconds. You're firing, and I'm tweeting behind you every 20 seconds what was going on. And that technique spread the influence, it spread the effectiveness of what was able to happen, and was mimicked by others in the Algerian gas plant attack, in the attacks in Mumbai and the takeover of the Taj Mahal hotel there, the grab and hold attacks that we've seen, and we've seen these with the Chechens, we've seen them within Russia, within Moscow itself. But this spreading of technique and the use of the internet and the use particularly of social media devices has been hugely effective in magnifying the impact of what you're doing, even if the killings dissipate or decline. Again, a hugely effective technique and leveraging of the media and the media prowess of these groups. Victims were often overtaken by this, ruled by fear, and would comply. And if they didn't comply, they would be bombarded with nasty images of beheadings, of a Jordanian pilot being burned to death in a cage, you may recall this, of things that are perpetuated or horrific acts that are perpetuated over and over again to indicate fear and to get compliance with the population. This worked very effectively and has continued to work very effectively in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Yemen, but particularly as a growing technique within Syria itself. And this highlights the idea of how conflict itself has changed, how groups have become much more sophisticated, much smarter about perpetuating conflict or violence or mass killings and human displacement. What's the principal tool of groups that function in this terror-like mindset? How are they so effective using these social media tools? What particular attribute do they push? What particular emotion do they push? Fear. Fear, absolute fear. And by using fear, they're able to grow their image. And so what we have seen, particularly in this instance, are groups that are non-government actors. Non-government actors, sometimes state-supported or state-sanctioned actors, a very important difference for those of us that study terrorism in those two components, state-sanctioned versus state-supported. But they use the use of non-government actors using fear as a dramatic technique. Call that the CNN effect. It's not killing people, it's having people walk around who are wounded or maimed or have lost limbs, or young girls and women that have been removed and then returned, and using victims to spread fear widely. And this creates a larger displacement and refugee effect. It magnifies the genocide, something that we have seen in terms of emotional effects and how it is ongoing and long outlives the event itself. This has been a particular technique of ISIS, as grown from ISIL and from other offshoot groups like Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, which operated in Iraq, and Al-Qaeda itself. And this is how the United States has generally looked at these changes. This is a map from the Pentagon, from a consultant to the Pentagon called Thomas Barnett, B-A-R-N-E-T-T. And Barnett talks about a functioning core of North and South. I'm going to show you the other side of the world here in just a second. But what we're particularly interested in is the boundary of the non-integrating gap. The boundary of the non-integrating gap in the middle here. The boundary of the non-integrating gap. What do you notice about the boundary of the non-integrating gap? How does it run? Across the equator, into lesser developed nations. And let's grow the boundary to the other side of the world. There's the boundary, which on the other side of the world doesn't look like a boundary. What's it look like? The other side of the world. This is known as the arc of instability in strategic parlance. In terms of US grand strategy, this is the arc of instability. A group of destabilized, not stable democracies or nations that have regimes that have insurgencies and ethnic conflicts, ongoing genocides and mass killings that run basically from Morocco to the Philippines. From Morocco to the Philippines. Not all of these countries are Muslim. Not all of these countries are democracies. But what else do you notice about this area of the world in the arc of instability? What is at the center of the arc of instability? What nation? Iran. Iran. The Iranians serve in the arc of instability as a central focus of US security policy as a result, and are hugely influential in what's happening in Syria and in what's happening, if you will, throughout the arc of instability itself. So it's been a particular preoccupation with U.S. foreign policy as a result. This non-integrating gap has an ongoing civil war right now in Yemen, an ongoing civil war, heterogeneous hybrid war going on in Syria, which has the potential to spill out beyond Iraq into the Saudi Peninsula, which is affecting the Horn of Africa, which affects shipping and traffic, which is the piracy region that we've seen over here, which affects obviously Afghanistan, where we're going to ramp up over the next 3 to 4 months, 3 to 6 months, which obviously affects everything that's going on here with a small set of islands. It's a combination of both strategic problems, traditional grand strategy problems that the United States has dealt with in our security policy that we know a lot about from the Cold War, as well as a series of evolving conflicts in which international institutions and our own foreign policy and security policy have not kept up. It has the potential for mass genocide that spins out of control and is long range and ongoing, with little that U.S. foreign policy and security policy can handle. And that's because of the transformation of war and the transformation of conflict and how conflict has changed. The actors that perpetuate genocide in Syria have perpetuated genocide in Iraq. And the conduct of war itself has changed dramatically since the end of the Cold War. It's much more technologically advanced and part of the CNN effect. It's much more media-centered and social media-centric. It's not so much mass killing as it is small elements of grouped killings that get magnified through the use and power of social media. The victimization and material impact are ongoing, but conflict itself has become much more dramatically effective and ongoing as a result of this. So we have created, if you will, a political economy and social structure of conflict. And the Pentagon is extremely worried about this. The United States government is extremely worried about this. This is called the Pentagon 2030 period, or the 2030 report. What the 2030 report is what replaces governance and government institutions for the rule of law. What groups deliver power and water and social structure and social welfare agencies for displaced populations? What kind of actors do that? ISIS, Al-Qaeda, organized crime, narco syndicates. They provide water and power and social welfare, which provides, if you will, to civilian populations who are no longer victims, but now have the ability to turn on the faucet, now have the ability to eat, heat their homes, under the reign of terror, with mass killings going on, but nonetheless, they replace governments. And this transformation of war and conflict, where they become pseudo-governments, is dramatic development over, or say, since the last 10 or 15 years. War becomes an outmoded concept. It doesn't just become politics by other means. It is profoundly political. That's why we like it in political science in terms of studying it, not engaging it. But it is dramatically different. How do you know if you're at war? Because ethnic conflict, insurgencies and civil wars, and genocide and mass killings have been around for a long, long time. But how do you know you're at war? Since the Treaty of Westphalia. How do you know you're at war since World War II? I'm sorry? People are dying. How many people? That is, how would you scientifically measure death in war? 1,000 battle deaths? That's typically what we've done. 1,000 battle deaths of uniformed troops. What happens if the troops aren't uniformed, or they're non-state actors, or they're terrorists? Or they're not so much sanctioned with one group, the Free Syrian Army, but with a whole bunch of different groups, some of which we support and like, and others which we don't. So our measurement of war and violence has become much more difficult in this environment with this adaptation. So war remains profoundly political, an extension of politics by other means, but also about governance. War becomes the conflict of delivering services under conflict and stress, which groups have become more sophisticated at doing as well. So we have new war, or what we call hybrid war, sometimes called net war, networked war. Civilian casualties, common. Mass killings, common. The loss of borders, recognizable in terms of its regular occurrence. Ethnic and religious conflict, been with us a long time. But how do we make a distinction between ethnic and religious conflict, insurgencies and civil wars, genocides that are traditionally recognized by the UN and those that are close or not recognized by the UN? Like the killing field I was in Somalia, where there were 18,000 bodies buried. And the women were there going through the sand with whisking off the clothing the last time they saw their husband or their brother. But not a recognized killing field and not a genocide, because it wasn't sanctioned by the UN. And as those conflicts perpetuate, as those conflicts become more in number, in these types of difficult circumstances, like we see in Syria or across the border in Iraq, how do we characterize these instances? How do we measure when there are more or less different battle deaths and uniformed troops? Also with the rise of warlords and warlordism. In other words, conflict has become global. Political scientists love these kind of fun terms. It's become globalized and local, just like the environmental movement. Conflict has become much more democratic, which means genocide and political violence is part of a broader spectrum of violence or pushing acts that are not that dissimilar from a political campaign about governance and direction, both dramatically different and not, having similar characteristics and repulsive to our humanity at the same time. Here's, for example, how this conflict has merged with two groups between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You have the shredding of borders, the non-recognition of laws of armed conflict or rules like the Geneva Accords or the Geneva Conventions, like the recognition of the Red Cross or other groups, or civilian quarters, and the use of and the provision of humanitarian assistance. You have a provision of weapons proliferation that's large. We use lots of drones. What do you think they use? Drones from Amazon. Same thing. In other words, how we engage in weapons proliferation, how we kill, and how we promulgate conflict becomes much more dramatic itself. It becomes much more democratic, where we're learning from each other. They read our stuff, we read their stuff. With obviously huge component of information technology and the use of the internet, again, those social media tools, all aligned along with perceived grievances with a population that listens to these messages, especially if they lack social services, especially if they lack institutions for learning or for economic success, jobs. Let's see how this works. Here's the four components and ideological questions of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that are an outgrowth of each other. One is expel America and establish an Islamic authority in the region, to establish the caliphate, if you will, in the arc of instability. This is how the Pentagon has kind of characterized this global war on terror, this long-running war, the war that isn't a war that has no end. Syria becomes a bystander in this. Obviously, the southern border of Turkey important, but also what's happening across the border between Syria and Iraq itself. Extend the jihad or the struggle to neighboring countries, thereby destabilizing, creating the arc of instability across the region. Remember, there's a key resource in this region. Destroy Israel. And remember your history. That this is a long-running struggle that begins and goes for long periods of time, seen in arcs of history or triumphs of history that are long-running and long-ranging. So the ethnic conflict and genocide that we see with the Yazidis, or that we see in Syria or with Kurdish populations, is just part of a longer-running struggle that will continue. All patterned by an uptick in activities and effectiveness. Anyone know what this is? So, what is that? That's the back of the Russian airliner that was taken down over Egypt. And that's the picture of the tonic water that held the explosive. So where did the bomb go? Right there. It exploded right there. What would you think would have been right there? You're all part of the CSI generation. Students generally love this stuff. Right? It blows up in the beverage cart. Takes down the back of the plane. This is not what's so important here, but let me show you this. There's the beak. This magazine is published 48 hours after the Paris attacks in November 2015. This is their Time magazine. The picture I just showed you was buried in this magazine. The media paid very close attention to the pictures of the Paris attacks that would produce this magazine 48 hours after they occurred. But that's not what ISIS was telling us. What ISIS was telling us is this, which was also in the magazine. What do you notice? What are they signaling? There is the remains of the Russian airliner. And what do they have pictures of? Russian passports. How would they get those? Who would have those? Egyptian intelligence. So what have they just signaled to you? That they have access to everything that's happening within the Egyptian intelligence organization. That's what's buried in Dabiq. In other words, what they have done is something that's different and dramatic, but also similar to someone else. They're doing exactly what Hitchcock tried to do. This type of terrorism, this type of genocide, this type of killing, what does it require? Not just the emotion of fear, but what's it require? An audience. Just like with Hitchcock. It requires an audience to make it effective. And this communication technique is hugely effective by these groups. So let's look at how ISIS has used this. We also call ISIS what? IS, ISIL, ISIS. What else do we call them? What did Secretary Kerry used to call them? Daesh? Why? There's a very particular reason for using that. You still see the Brits using that and some US diplomats using the term Daesh. It has links to the 7/7 bombings, the London attacks of 7/7, 2005, which were a group of activists organized by Al-Qaeda around a football league, which was a principal breeding ground within the UK itself. ISIS or Daesh forms in 2014 with Dr. al-Baghdadi heading the group, establishing the caliphate. Here's some of their earlier highlights. The beheading of the Jordanian pilot in northern Syria, the shoot down and capture and then the burning of him, the beheading of another one. Video beheadings that were prominent within the BBC and within US media outlets. Series of executions, not just of Yazidis, but of others. All filmed and put on YouTube. Beheading of American journalist James Foley. Blowing up holy sites, museums, antiquities. Pretty prolific in the early years. And yet operating in an area that is conflicted in terms of its influences and the divisions between Sunni and Shia. With a 5-year plan to reorder that area of the world. You can read about this in Dabiq. Again, showing you that, if you will, arc of instability. And the Institute for the Study of War, I'll show you several maps from there to show you their campaign, their global campaign and series of attacks, which are not just confined to Syria and Iraq, or activities that are in Syria and Iraq, but are confined to Syria, Iraq, and a lot of attacks in and around Turkey itself, as a crossroads between East and West, as well as the Saudi Peninsula. spillovers and learning that going on with these groups. With affiliated or inspired groups across the arc of instability. With a wide battle of control. Within Syria itself, with those lines out of Raqqa. Again, pay very close attention to these lines and these streams that come out. This is about 2014, 2015, kind of their apex. Where they were using extortion, taxation, oil revenues, money from state-owned banks. You might recall we blew up several places in stashes of cash. Kidnapping, ransoms. And the use of a derogatory term by diplomats and members of the national security team to refer to them basically as, this is a caricature of Dr. al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. What does it look like? A jackass, and it's done on purpose, along with the use of Daesh as a derogatory remark against ISIS itself. In other words, swearing at them, if you will, in common parlance. Here's the capital in Raqqa. Raqqa, Syria. And they have a detailed organizational chart, not unlike something you would read in the Harvard Business Review about a well-known corporation or well-known company like Apple or IBM or HP, with recognized leaders that we frequently target with drones or with U.S. Special Forces or those of the allies. Look at the councils that they have, a financial council, a leadership council, a legal council. We would typically call these cabinet departments within a recognized government. They've set up a quasi-government in Raqqa to operate, to continue to perpetuate their violence as long as they can, or their influence, if you want to think of it that way. This is an outgrowth of similar instances of what we saw with early al-Qaeda, but also much more sophisticated, headed by al-Baghdadi, who has a Ph.D. And is at least as influential and inspirational as Dr. Zawahiri of al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden. This is from the Amazon UK webpage for Dabiq, for which you can buy copies of Dabiq, but don't buy it. You can download it. This is just to give you an idea. Average versions are about 75 to 85 megabytes. You can learn how to bake a cake and build a bomb in the same oven with your mother. Again, don't download this anywhere but in a public place or in a public URL. All right, I'm very serious about this. Our government monitors who's downloading Dabiq. All right, so download it in the library. These are the last two versions of Dabiq. It lays out both Arab leaders and Muslim world leaders that are friendly to the United States and should be targeted for killings. It explains why those who are less pure and less firm in their beliefs should be eliminated so that you can expand genocide like against groups like the Yazidis or the Kurds or others, and effective ways that you can do this to upset governance and replace it with effective things, like, for example, the delivery of social welfare services, which are also part of the Dabiq magazine. Yes? It's primarily designed to be the English Time magazine, but it's published in 17 languages. Yeah, 17 languages. Until recently, it was 15 languages. I don't know what the last two languages are. It's a good question, but it's 17 languages now. It's widely available. Again, public URL, all right? The Avalon Project at Yale University, Avalon Law Project, AVALON, the Avalon Law Project at Yale University, has all versions of Dabiq, and it's safe to download it from there if you're interested in it. Again, about 75 to 85 megabytes. It's in color. A few people are here from my terrorism class. I hand around copies of it to read, to look at. You don't get to keep it, but you get to look at it, all right? But it's rich in terms of ideology and what's happening, and in terms of their activities that are both peaceful and those that are extremely violent. This gives you an idea of the operations of ISIS. Again, just showing you the media coverage. They have a whole media arm which publishes Dabiq. We are not so much interested in shutting down Dabiq. Why not? We get lots of information and we communicate with them using it. So we keep open channels of communication. So if you think we don't communicate with terrorists, you're wrong. We talk to them all the time. All right? Here's an example of foreign fighters that are involved with this, which ISIS uses to perpetuate some of those genocidal attacks, like those against the Yazidis. But a huge number that are used all over that arc of instability. And here we go. Let's look at the control of terrain and how they've operated. So this is the view from Raqqa, looking which way, east or west? I'm testing you. Looking towards Iraq, so that would be looking east. Thank you, it's good, right? What do you notice about their line of influence on this map? It's very narrow. What are they following? Roads and waterways. Roads and waterways, very narrow. Roads and waterways. Here's a better look at it from up above. Right across the border areas into Sinjar, some of the earliest areas where the Yazidis were killed by ISIS, all the way to Raqqa, indicating both control zones, attack zones, and support zones with the Kurds based in this area. What do you think about the extent of influence for ISIS? Huge, but thin. Huge, but thin. Their control in 2011, 2013, just before they formally become affiliated in the transition period, if you want to think of it that way. Again, they arrive in 2014. But showing you some of that interesting areas for how they strategically located themselves around the Haditha Dam, for example, or on roads and waterways that are strategic. And if we look at the Syrian situation more closely, we see a whole host of actors in difficulty. We see, if you will, Syrian armed forces to the south in Damascus, around Homs, around where the Russians are located, Latakia. We see opposition forces that are much more problematic than this. The green doesn't do them justice. I'll show you this in a few seconds. With, if you will, ISIL, Islamic State of the Levant, operating in and around Raqqa. With ISIS control, that again is narrow. But the geographers are having a field day with this. This gives us an idea of what has happened in one particular area, for how movement has occurred and how the extension of influence has occurred in terms of civilian terror, or terrorizing civilians with the use of ISIS and their techniques, with groups that are Al-Qaeda affiliated and jihadist groups, but also part of the Free Syrian Army and a part of a series of tribes. Those that involve the Kurdish forces and operate in very narrow areas along those green belts of waterways and roads that are not far from each other, not separated very far, but run dramatically in different fashion. And the model for this is Somalia and Mogadishu, where block by block is controlled by different clans and different groups, literally city block by city block, thereby confusing the conflict and making it very difficult to hold individuals accountable for war crimes or crimes against humanity. And check these two maps out. So let me go back. These maps are from the government of Australia. I love this map. Look at this map. What is that? Those are highways, roadways. Looks like a AAA roadway map. If you were going to take a luxury drive across Syria, that's what it looks like. But it gives you some idea of declared areas for ISIS, even though they're controlling much narrower areas along those corridors of waterways and roadways. But giving you some idea if you want to drive through. And I'm going to update the military situation or show you more recently what's been happening in these areas. As you can see, There have been dramatic changes even in short periods of time. For those areas that are controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, those that are controlled by Damascus or that regime of Bashar al-Assad, as well as those areas that are ISIS controlled and have been decreasing. Notice the city name, the symbolic capital, which also provides the name for their Time magazine, their version of Time. The most recent declassified map that we're able to get, February and March, getting things much later than that is classified. The ISIS sanctuaries have shrunk in Syria, but what's happened on the other side of the border? They've grown in Iraq. And as Iraqi government forces have increased their capability in those areas, and those areas are constrained, Yemen crops up, Somalia crops up, Morocco crops up, parts of Libya crop up. The spilling over of effective technique and the targeting of populations for genocide continues. With a rival group called Al-Nusra Front. Breaking away, and most recently, earlier this year, a creation of groups complicating the Syrian case where coalitions are loose. I didn't even divide Syria up into north, south, east, and west, but you're able to do this if you go to the Intel Center and you look at the maps at the Intel Center to understand the affiliation of groups. This is a very dramatically multivariable, complex, complicated case of competing forces, some of which are loosely affiliated for periods of time and then they disentangle themselves. For example, these are all of the other nations that are involved. For example, protecting the Assad regime with Iranian troops. More Iranian nationals have been killed in the Syrian civil war than those of any other nation, except for Syria itself, obviously. Hezbollah, militia, the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, Al-Qaeda, the Army of Islam. Notice the Free Syrian Army, supported by us, or having some affiliation with us, not formally with the United States government, but with what are called other government agencies. Do you understand the euphemism? And look who also influences or is involved with FSA, Al-Qaeda. All loosely affiliated. And you can see why we've been now decided to arm the Kurds, because the Kurds serve as the middleman here in this conflict and have been hugely effective in Iraq, especially in northern Iraq, in pushing back against the influence of ISIS and other groups. The most recent map available for Russian airstrikes. What do you notice about Russian airstrikes? Where are they concentrated in? In the west, not far from their main air base, near the Mediterranean, which means, where's ISIS based? Here. That's our problem, not their problem as much. Low confidence airstrikes mean lots of civilian casualties, lots of collateral damage without laser directed weapons or weapons pods. And the Russians have engaged in a high number of testing with their weapons using new technologies. So here are some of the challenges that exist for us. Some of these challenges is that war and conflict has changed dramatically and has become much more irregular, much more disruptive. Categories, if you will, A, not B, but A and D, irregular and disruptive. Much less likely to be catastrophic, what we learned or dealt with in the Cold War, in the development of deterrence theory, and much less about being traditional, or categories B and C. Conflict now becomes box A and box D, and the merging of those boxes, if you will. This is a derivative of Bob Jervis's what are known as his security boxes, where the likelihood and difficulty of dealing with these problems in categories A and D is much more dramatic. Where you try to acquire breakthrough capabilities or new capabilities that can't be handled by American power or by Western power, to erode influence in different ways. And Syria is exactly that case. a regime that tried to acquire nuclear weapons. And the Israelis bombed this facility in September 2007 using North Korean technology that was sold to the Syrians with both French and West German contractors. And challenging U.S. grand strategy in the process, where we're not equipped to deal with humanitarian crises and displacement. With application all over the world. This is how we've tried to deal with it, by being everywhere all the time. Whether we're running security cooperation programs in Southeast Asia, the Trans-Sahara Counter-Terror Initiative, Trans-Sahelan Initiative, the Horn of Africa Joint Task Force, which is based just north of Somalia and Djibouti, or whether we're engaged in more traditional operations against homegrown terrorists and radicals in Europe, working with European countries, or the Middle East itself, in terms of moving beyond war and trying to develop economies and scale and deliver those social welfare services and jobs that don't exist in places suffering from genocide and the like in the Middle East. All of this is predicated on what is called failed states or fragile states. The failed states index. And this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Do states fail because of the presence of terrorism or groups like ISIS, or insurgencies in the presence of genocide and ethnic conflict and civil wars? Or do those occurrences have another effect? Are they precursors? Are they indicators? And what happens if they are across borders? So a real chicken and egg problem erupts from how you understand the causality of these things and the correlational effects that result, and has tremendous human and legal aspects. We have legal institutions that are not well developed or not sophisticated for dealing with issues of torture or the range of humanitarian crimes, even of those identified in the Rome Statute and Article 8, which is extensive, exhaustive, but doesn't cover the full gamut of activities. And not everyone recognizes or uses the International Criminal Court as well. So the laws of war and the laws of armed conflict haven't kept up with the actual occurrences of what's going on, especially atrocities against non-combatants and civilians. So we have weak states, failing states, states that lack governance in areas of conflict that provide, in some level, for some populations, hope for delivery of social services, and on the other hand, areas of dramatic violence perpetuated with the use of social media on the web. Ungoverned spaces, if you want to think of it that way. And these ungoverned spaces raise huge questions about how we move forward. Because what ISIS will do is morph or change into another group in another area. And that area can be even beyond Syria, or we're dealing with the Yazidis, or other areas. In other words, what we see is the development of competing governance. This is being very forgiving to the development of these groups, but competing governance structures that perpetuate or democratize, in other words, their presence, not the value of democracy, but their presence perpetuating all across the world. And we see this over and over again. And that's the lesson of Syria, it's the lesson of Iraq, it's the lesson of Afghanistan, it's the lesson of Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and so forth. These zones of competing governance are not equal governance, but competing governance for the delivery of services that are both terror-like, fearful, and at the same time also deliver things to populations that did not exist before, like power, like social structures, social welfare agencies, and the like. This is exactly the model we've seen with many groups, like Hezbollah, like Al-Qaeda, like the use of groups, early bin Laden groups of Al-Qaeda in the Sudan, in other areas of the world. With that, I'll end, and I'll take your questions. Thank you very much for having me. So the question was, what do we see happening with the Kurdish people and with the
future of a Kurdistan-like operation in those areas of the world kind of moving forward given the situation. I don't see a Biden-like establishment of a Kurdish state anytime soon, particularly given the instability and the difficulty of the situation of Erdogan in Turkey. The Turks have a very problematic set of issues going on that's affecting their ability to deal with Europe and East-West. As long as those things remain up in the air, the destabilized Kurdish situation, I would argue, will remain. Iraq's not anywhere close to being stable. Afghanistan's not anywhere close to being stable. Syria will remain a mess in the near term. So I don't see anything happening in terms of an established Kurdish state, say northern Iraq, something like that, near Turkey itself for more than a decade, certainly more than 2 decades, I think. It'll take a long time for that to work out. Hi, please.
You said we were unequipped to help with displacement. Are we unequipped or are we unwilling?
Hold on just a second. So we haven't characterized what happened to the Yazidis, or a lot of what ISIS has done as genocide. We've called it historically anomalous in several situations. That was Samantha Power, the former UN ambassador. There seems to be a great reluctance by traditional U.S. diplomats and traditional U.S. actors who are unwilling to get involved in some of these things. I know you had a lecture on Rwanda, I believe. So the reluctance that we saw with the Clinton administration, the reluctance that we've seen repeatedly, I think will continue. So there's an unwillingness. But part of that unwillingness is we lack a capability to deal with it effectively. We are great at going to war. We're not so good at managing conflicts like this that are complicated. So I think it's both unwilling and a lack of capability.
What effect does Israel have on this?
Let's take a look at a map. The question was, what effect does Israel have on this situation? Let me go back a little bit. Let's get a good map so we can kind of see this a little bit. The Israelis are tremendously concerned about the stability of Jordan and the stability of the regime in Jordan. And I think that's really much more influential to their immediate needs than what's happening with the Bashar al-Assad regime in Damascus. But they're worried about the effect that this has, obviously, in the Golan Heights and in Beirut, the stability of Lebanon. But they're acting largely behind the scenes. It's Gulf state nations like Kuwait, like Qatar, like Bahrain, that have been operating to try to develop something because they see threats to their regimes. And the Israeli government has been working quietly with them in that regard. But it's not just a bad neighborhood. It's a good question, Marina. It's a neighborhood that seems to be perpetually destabilized, or will be for some period of time, especially given the region up here. But as you know, there's a whole series of plans to engage in pipelines for both energy and water resources north of Turkey, and that's problematic as well, given all of this. So right now, their influence has been vocal, but largely not visible in terms of what they're doing within Damascus itself, or I'm sorry, within Syria itself. And they let us do the heavy lifting on a lot of this. And I'd like to make one more distinction. What's happening in this area of Syria, not so much this region, which has largely been out of the realm of influence of U.S. forces and British forces, what is happening between the Syria and Iraq border, so western Iraq and eastern Syria, that has largely been left to us. And we have been unable to manage, if you will, or not capable of managing that area together with what's going on in Iraq. And I would argue to you, if we're going to ramp up in Afghanistan, that's going to strain us even further. So the Israeli role will become much more important. Yes? Hi.
What do you see as the role of Turkey in all of this with its growing changes and instability, particularly as it relates to the Kurdish populations on the borders?
So the question is, what's the role of Turkey in this environment, particularly with regard to the Kurds and what's happening in their border, and with the attacks that Kurdish groups, terror groups, have perpetuated or suspected of perpetuating within Turkey itself. Turkey is a key maybe as equally important to the strategic situation as Israel for this particular area. They're a NATO member. They have a president who just received additional powers that make him even stronger. He has a very difficult relationship because of the number of Turks that have moved throughout Europe, particularly in Germany. There are a number of refugees, particularly from the Syrian conflict and from other conflicts, that have moved through Turkey. So Turkey is a key actor in this regard. But the Turks have also worked to destabilize much of the Syrian situation because they're very worried about this Kurdish establishment of a state, or what happens in the underbelly in southern Turkey, as well as in eastern Turkey as well. So the Kurdish problem assumes or subsumes everything else for them. And that presents a great deal of friction with us and with others, particularly their NATO allies. So I think that's going to continue for a while. We're going to see a lot of problems and continuing to have a lot of pressures with Turkey, and it's unclear what United States foreign policy, security policy is going to be. Because if the Syrian conflict continues to spin out of control, genocide and mass killings, or ISIS rears, or if ISIS morphs into helping other groups that are insurgents within Turkey, it could destabilize that regime, which could be very problematic, which the Russians would be terribly interested in. Yes, please.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about, something that I think we hear in the news a lot, or there's debates about like social media, use Twitter, use Facebook. What is the United States, or what are governments doing to combat it? How effective has that been?
So the question was, we talked a lot about social media and the use of social media, particularly in combating some of these insurgent groups, and what has the United States government done, and how have we dealt with it. We monitor chat rooms. We monitor Twitter feeds. We have been engaged in long-running comments with folks like this. The Combating Terrorism Center at West Point has been involved with this for some time. But the use of social media and the creation of tools and the use of kind of trying to push different agendas was particularly useful in Iraq after 2005, when we were able, as part of the portraying strategy, to leverage groups against each other, to create rivalries. So the way we've used it is in an offensive way, to try to create rivalries through Facebook or through different social media devices to create factions and pressures against each other. That's how we've tried to leverage it. But it's absolutely critical for kind of this role. We've also used it to talk to them, speak with them, and to engage in debates about their Quranic, or their beliefs about the Quran. And we do that all the time. Yes, please.
Seeing in your research, how stable is Egypt as a peace partner for Israel, and stable as an influence in the region?
Great question. I took out a few slides about Egypt, just so you know. Maybe I should put them back. The question was about the role of Egypt in all of this. Egypt is a key actor because of the principal book that inspired the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, the MB, which is basically the forefather of modern Al-Qaeda and the forefather of ISIS. And the book called The Management of Savagery. You can download that book whenever you want. But The Management of Savagery, or The Management of Chaos, is another title of it. It's one of the principal tomes of the modern-day MB Muslim Brotherhood, which is the precursor to the current government of Egypt. It is a huge organization providing a whole host of services that are not just violent derivatives, but also social welfare services that I talked about that are very sophisticated, like you see with Hezbollah and Hamas. And their influence isn't going anywhere soon, but you also have one of the most professional militaries and the most professional set of military officers trained largely by the United States and by Western NATO-affiliated nations that provide some level of stability. Of course, we could say the same thing about Turkey, and that's presented a whole bunch of problems. But Egypt, remaining relatively peaceful and stable, would be a huge boon. And I would argue back to Professor Goodman's question about Israel. If that destabilizes, that presents a huge dilemma for the Israelis. They'll be a lot less concerned about Syria, and that works to the Russians' benefit. So all of this kind of unfolds. Wow, not very uplifting. Please. If you look at the arc of instability, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, southern Sahel, all of that area. We can't control or influence all of that area. But Tunisia has hugely symbolic, like Algeria, hugely symbolic power for the stability of North Africa. As one of the first nations to engage in the Arab Spring, and the spin out from that Arab Spring, it's not hugely strategic, but hugely symbolic in terms of what is happening or how things are changing. But if I try to give you the impression that groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda inspired, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, are really good at spillovers and moving around. So moving from Somalia and Yemen, from Syria, or out of Iraq, into and across North Africa, or areas in the south of North Africa, like southern Tunisia, would be a very important component to this, and a huge propaganda boost for what these groups are doing. Something worth watching, but not as critical as in Israel, actions that are a little bit under the radar, or what's happening with Egypt, or Turkey for that matter. Please.
Can we go back to the map of Morsi of war? There's a map of Morsi.
Yeah. Was it early?
Sorry?
Was it early?
No. It's not the slides. It's about the proxy of war, and you show you addressed the countries that support the Kurds, support Indonesia,
Oh.
support
Yeah. For what was happening in Syria itself? Yeah. Sure. Hold on a second. Sorry. Some of the slides. The latest update that showed this. Give me just a second. This one?
Yes.
Showing the complicated nature of this.
Yeah. So I didn't see ISIS in this map. I'm curious to know who supported ISIS. Those like organized McCuan, very smart. They're using very, very new technologies. Everybody has that curiosity to know who supported ISIS.
So can I take a second for fabulous questions, by the way? Really good questions. So ISIS, as you may recall, yeah, the question was, looking at this, he doesn't see ISIS up here. Okay. Fabulous question. Iran, Shia or Sunni? Test. Shia. Thank you. Okay. Physically shot. All right. Shia. Most of Syria is Sunni, right? Notice Iranian troops. And most of ISIS is Sunni, generally. The Iranians are working in both with the Assad regime and with ISIS itself. They're working both sides. Not by providing troops to ISIS, but by providing material, technique, particularly those imploders that take out, if you will, that go through the bottom floors of armored vehicles to explode within the side of the vehicles, which they used for very great effect for ISIL and for Al-Qaeda in the Levant in 2005, 2006 against U.S. forces. So the Iranians have been providing training and material and helping ISIS proper, al-Baghdadi, to help destabilize a lot of the actions of the United States and the coalition, the Allied forces, if you will. And at the same time, the Iranians have been providing troops, a number of generals and a number of flag officers, to the Assad regime as well. ISIS isn't up here because they're much more loosely affiliated. Let me come back one. So if you look at the Syrian case, the Free Syrian Army and the different battalions, if we look at what ISIS had as its affiliates, north and south, while Raqqa is the center, it's a much more loosely inspired organization. It's much more fluid. And we can't even have a model of them as like a network with a central node. It's more like that central node, al-Baghdadi and the cabinet and the shura, the council, is much looser in affiliation than it is directing exactly what's going on, which will make it very difficult. It'll be easy to take over Raqqa at some level, but difficult to manage what's happening. I don't think that's exactly the question. Yeah. While supporting also.
Yeah, but ISIS is considered like as a Sunni group, which is, that's made a question that is Sunni countries supporting the Sunni group
Right.
to be HPR. So let's say there's another part supporting ISIS against Iraq.
Right.
So can we address that?
So what we see when we look at a group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, they often have a common common enemy. I laid out kind of 4 principal ideas: the establishment of the caliphate, removing the United States from the Middle East, taking on Israel. When we look at how these groups operate, their alliances are not always dichotomous or clear. Let me give you an example. Groups that don't like the U.S. government might include Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, ISIS-affiliated groups, and what other domestic terror groups in the United States. White supremacist groups, narco-syndicate groups, anti-Israeli groups, and presumably ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups would be pretty anti-Israeli. But they all share technique, and they all share technology, they all share information with each other, they all communicate with each other, because they have a larger common enemy. And I think this is one of the problems with thinking of war in traditional ways in conflict, is the alliances are much more complicated than that. So we don't have one good model for this. The model I usually use for students is, you started with McDonald's to develop burgers, where do you get your burger now? You get it animal style. Or you get it at Five Guys, or at Wendy's. There are multiple different models for how you get that burger. There's no good one model for what the relationship is. It's much more nuanced than that. That's part of the issue. For the common enemy. That's a good question. Yes, please. Yes. Yeah. I took it out. That's good. Yeah, that's excellent. I could. At the Institute for Study of War, all right, there is a nice graphic that shows you, if you look just north of Armenia, the first ISIS-established caliphates of an alternative nature were established just north of Armenia. The first ones that were declared. Yeah. Yeah, it's in Georgia. Yeah. The first ones. The earliest ones. 2014, right when they started. Yeah, they're not formal, but they were recognized as part of the caliphate. Established that area. So Armenia is squeezed in a tremendous way. Absolutely. With North and South Ossetia. That's exactly right. Please. If you email me, I'll send you a graphic if you'd like to see it. Please.
With our failing relations with Turkey, do you feel like there's going to be any movement forward with the U.S. recognizing the Armenian genocide?
The question was, with our difficult relations or failing relations with Turkey, will this make a difference or change in recognizing the Armenian genocide? You're asking me about the current U.S. government, which changes its mind every 20 minutes. I'm sorry, but I don't think it will. We're not there yet, but I know in 21 minutes that answer will be wrong. It's a very good question. It's a bit uncertain as to where this regime and what the Trump administration will do for a chance at each moment. But there's tremendous resistance within Congress to that. But the administration is a little bit uneven. So that's my qualifier. Please.
What do you see as the future of Syria's refugees?
The question is, what do we think about, or where do we see the future of the Syrian refugee problem? That number has the potential, if the United States has a prolonged engagement with the Kurds in Raqqa, or there are problems within Raqqa, the refugee problem has the potential to triple. Triple. There's a RAND study. You'll email me, send it to you. It has the potential to triple. This is what really worries the Turks, not so much the Israelis. But the Turks are tremendously worried about this, because they know that they'll have to do something with those refugees if that number triples, and they want to send them to Europe, which presents a tremendous amount of problems as Angela Merkel faces elections in the fall, if my memory is correct. So the potential for that problem is huge. And I would argue that we have paid little to no attention to that because we're more preoccupied with any refugee problem that might involve North and South Korea with China, just as one example. Now that might change the plans. Please.
Do you think Saudi Arabia has a role in what's going on in Syria?
Fantastic question. Do we think that Saudi Arabia has a role in what's happening in Syria? The Saudis are essentially conducting operations against the civil war that's going on in Yemen in the south. But they do not want to be left out of any negotiations for a negotiated settlement or ceasefires that go on within Syria itself, because they don't want to leave it to those that are part of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. The Bahrainis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, those from UAE. As a result, the Saudis are playing all over the place, and they're as important or key actor as the Iranians are. The Iranians being involved in more nefarious things, we think, but the Saudis equally involved in a number of activities across there. Because if you looked at the maps and saw, if you will, past Jordan into northern Saudi Arabia, it's a real problem for them to extend their influence to work in both areas for the Saudi forces, which affects the stability of the House of Saudi. So they are hugely involved in this, and they don't want to cede control to those smaller states of the GCC as well. Please. But my mentor is not, but I'll do better. The question is, what do I think we should do to resolve some of these issues with Syria? The only issue, back to your question about Kurdish, what to do with the Kurdish population, what to do with the Syrian issue. The only way to solve this problem is through negotiated settlement. Let's be candid about this. It's too difficult to extend influence in an area the size of the United Kingdom across two borders, two countries, with a hugely burgeoning population and a NATO ally, the Kurds, into Turkey, while trying to protect a regime that is losing influence amongst its population in Jordan because of how young the Jordanian population is and the high levels of unemployment in that area, which affects Israeli stability, while the Saudi regime is helping us in a proxy war in the south, while things are changing within the Gulf itself, which gives Iran an advantage. So in that sense, I think you have to talk to your enemies in a negotiated settlement. I think that's it. Otherwise, we will see a tripling of refugees and a 50% increase in death, in casualties, easily, in that area. And we are not equipped to do that. Please. There has been the question is, will we see a return of sectarian violence in Lebanon, a la what we saw in the 1980s? It has ebbed and flowed. We look at suicide bombing, suicide terrorism, something to do with terrorism, of course. While it has ebbed and flowed, it seems to have a campaign cycle to it. So I would argue it's not a return, it's just an episode or uptick that is predictable. I didn't say regular or habitual, but predictable. And then a decline. It's pretty normal that we would see that. If the Syrian regime is destabilized and you're Bashar al-Assad, what should you do? You should expand the conflict. Law, or rule of war, lawmaking 101. Expand the zone. And that's what should happen, which further threatens that complexity of casualties and displacement of refugees. So I would anticipate that would happen. Please.
What's going on? How long do you give Assad? How long do you think this is power?
Tell the Russians are ready to sell him out. I think he can be there as long as he wants. To be perfectly honest with you, he should have been gone long ago. If there was a simple solution to this complex problem, we would have done it. And there isn't. And he can remain as long as the Russians are his benefactor. And the Russians do not want to lose face over Syria, because it affects, if you will, the region of the arc of instability. And they're willing to live with ISIS as a result. They're willing to manage that as a result, which is very problematic for us, which is exactly how they would like it, whether they're in with Trump or not. That's a joke.
Someone asked to speak about the Kobe firing, so we thank him very
Josh.
much.
I think the last word.
All right, perfect.
Say something interesting.
Something interesting. But what I was going to ask was, how does growing far-right populism in Europe, how will it affect the radicalization of youth of the Muslim population in France and Belgium, and will this become a European problem in terms of ISIS global campaign of terrorism?
Huge recruitment is the role of youth activism as a recruitment or place for ISIS in Europe and throughout. It's the principal recruitment area for foreign fighters in Syria and throughout this area of Arab instability, and that will continue. It's only going to grow. Thank you all very much.